So earlier this year, I was seeing a lot of videos surrounding the OG pocket cinema camera from Blackmagic, and I wanted to see what all the hype was about. So, of course, I bought one. And let me tell you, I definitely got influenced, and have since returned the camera. Now, if you want to know why, stick around because I have a lot to say about this camera. The camera features a micro four thirds 1080p sensor with an alleged 13 stops of dynamic range. The Fairchild sensor used in this camera is also one of the main things that makes the camera stand out and continue to draw in a cult following even after 12 years. The main reason? Character, which is starting to become my new favorite buzzword up there with cinematic. Because you see, one of the biggest things people talk about with this sensor is that it has sort of a unique quality, kind of a color that all newer sensors struggle to capture. Just kind of a feel. Now, while I'm not 100% in line with that school of thought, I do admit that when looking at the footage straight out of the camera, I was kind of like, okay, I can kind of see what you mean. But honestly, you could probably replicate it on newer cameras by just massaging it in post. And I'll talk a little bit about what draws me into that conclusion later on. So, in order to capture what this sensor has to offer, you're going to want to shoot on the raw codec this camera provides, which is 12-bit Cine DNG RAW. The alternative is 10-bit ProRes 422HQ, but honestly, if you're buying this camera, you're probably not buying it to shoot ProRes. Now, of course, with RAW recording comes the need for higher performance memory. And in doing some research around this camera, I kept hearing there are only a specific few cards that really worked, especially when you're trying to shoot in RAW. Now, to my surprise, when I first got the camera, I popped in the Sony SD card I had lying around. I was like, oh cool, no issues. I wonder if we've just come a really long way since this camera was released. But then I lost that SD card. So I grabbed a random SanDisk card I had, and when I went to format it, it wasn't even an option. So I was like, okay, well, maybe this was just one of the incompatible ones. Only to realize all of my SanDisk cards wouldn't format. So after scouring online to figure out what's good and frankly not going to break the bank because I'm sure something from Angelwood would work just fine, I wasn't going to spend that much on a camera that was supposed to be a neat budget find. Eventually, I found one random forum comment that just said it needed to be rated V60 or higher. So sure enough, I got this Sabrent V60 card off Amazon and it worked just fine, giving me about 30 minutes of shooting in Cine DNG. Next up was the lenses. One of the nice things about lenses for this camera is that because it is micro four thirds, you can adapt it to EF, or you can even use a micro four thirds to EF speed booster, which will get you an extra stop of light that can be handy in low light scenarios. This was the route I was initially going to take, but then I realized my only EF lens was on loan to a friend, so that didn't happen. Instead, I picked up an Olympus zoom lens on Amazon, which was actually surprisingly fun to work with, and on the plus side, it kept the footprint very small. However, one of the downsides I noticed almost immediately is that because the camera was much smaller and lighter, it was harder to keep stable compared to a lot of the heavier builds I work with. This, paired with a lens without image stabilization, led to me getting some really shaky footage that honestly made me reevaluate my career choice. So when looking for lenses for this camera, you'll want to look for lenses that have some sort of image stabilization, or when working with Cine lenses, just make sure a rig is properly built so you can balance the build, especially once you add a battery on there. Now let's talk about how I actually rigged this camera up for shooting. First up, for power, the camera takes a Nikon EL-EN20 battery. But in my experience, I got about 20 minutes of standby time and only about 10 to 15 minutes of actual shoot time using them. It's such a tiny battery that realistically, I wasn't expecting much anyways. So it's basically a requirement that you give the camera external power. Two common options I saw are either using a D-tap to 12 volt DC cable or using an MPF battery plate with a 12 volt DC to DC cable. I opted for the D-tap to 12 volt so I could just use my existing V-mount batteries, but later regretted that, and I wouldn't recommend that to anyone else if you're not using this on a set or just can't keep it super rigged up to go. The MPF plate route is just way more convenient and has a much smaller blueprint than the abomination I rigged up. This was definitely one of the things that really contributed to my negative experience with the camera, was just having to be tethered all the time, which took away from the small and portable feel I was expecting to get from this camera. One bonus though was that when I got really fed up with the whole cable situation, I could just unplug the DC adapter and shoot straight from the internal battery since it did charge while plugged into the V-mount. Speaking of ports, the camera also has a mic, headphone, LAN-C port, and a micro HDMI port. There's truly no display standard I despise more than micro HDMI looking back to my A7 III. It works, but it is fragile, and all it takes is the slightest bump to break either the port or the cable, and even any sort of pressure on it started to cut out signal. I was able to remedy this by using a cable clamp that screwed into the cage, but eventually gave up because using this with my Cine 7 was just proving to be a terrible maneuver. Speaking of cages, what cage was I able to find in the year 2025, you might ask? Well, as it turns out, the camera is similarly sized to the EOS M, so I used this half cage from Cambait that screwed directly into the bottom quarter 20 mounting hole. My only complaint was it couldn't screw into the top one as well for extra stability. But it didn't really shift much on me, and for the price, I was more than fine with it. However, this is one of the things I did wish I researched into a bit more, as I later discovered there is a ton of 3D printed accessories you can print for this camera that would do a much better job, especially at a much lower cost than what you would pay for the official options. I'll make sure to link these down below in case you or your friend has a 3D printer, as well as there is a lot of services where you can send them the file and they'll ship you the print after it's done. Now, I mentioned using a monitor earlier, and personally I feel as though it's basically a requirement to use this with your camera unless you want to use a sun hood or a loop viewfinder sort of situation. You see, the screen on the camera is so dim that it was really hard to tell what I was shooting almost all of the time. And this led me to keeping it really close to my face, or just honestly shooting and hoping for the best. Alright, it's finally time for what I'm sure you came here for, the footage. Originally when I got this camera, I actually got it with the plan to shoot a short I had lined up. However, that was delayed due to shipping delays, and by the time I got it, I started to realize I really didn't have enough time to compensate for the downsides to warrant wasting time on set. So instead, during a trip to San Diego, I took the camera for a walk through Balboa Park. Something that stuck out to me was how this camera handles highlights, and by that, I mean it doesn't. When I had a decently exposed foreground, I felt like any highlights in the background were just absolutely blowing out. While yes, I get properly exposing your footage and you don't have to worry about that, sometimes I like to have the Creatum to purposely blow out small portions of my image, and it becomes more distracting when they begin to almost look deep fried. In my testing between 400 and 800 ISO, I also found the difference to be pretty negligible in the highlights. Because of this, I found it's basically essential to shoot with my zebras on at either 90 or 95% threshold. I felt more comfortable at 90, as well as you definitely need to make sure you have an ND filter on deck. I will say though, when I did pull the footage in Resolve, I was able to make these clipped highlights a lot less egregious using highlight recovery, allowing for a much smoother and less distracting roll-off. So I guess that shows you kind of how far the technology's come since this camera was originally introduced. Speaking of light, low light. So how does this camera handle low light? I found it actually held up surprisingly well in low light in both 400 ISO and its native 800 ISO. There was definitely some noise present, but honestly, I found it to be pretty organic. That being said, I didn't push the camera down super far, but I'm never shooting in complete darkness anyways, and I find dark exteriors where you are shooting still have lots of lights around, so I'm really not concerned with it competing with something like an FX3 or an FX6. I would never use it for those kinds of work anyway, as the camera's just not built for that. So, does the sensor have that magic? After I reviewed the footage and played around with it some, I will say I do understand what people talk about when they mean it has a certain kind of feel to it. I love the natural color straight out of the transform, and I also noticed that because of the way the camera handles highlights, it has this weird sort of almost color fringing that almost begins to look like halation to me. This made me wonder if this, combined with some cheaper lenses, softer glass, and the difference between 1080p and 4K, makes people feel as though it's almost film emulation built into the camera that they've become subconsciously drawn to. That's all speculation, of course, and at the end of the day, it is all subjective to everyone's own tastes. The final verdict, the good. It looks great, it's small, it's lightweight, and has a wonderful image if you don't clip your highlights. The bads. The power with a constant need for an external power source. The screen is super dim, and also something I noticed is the camera really did not like fast movements. It almost looked like severe rolling shutter, but when I put it in playback, I didn't see the effect reproduced. The lack of image stabilization for a small camera, it's something I find really useful in the FX30 and FX3. Oh, and of course, the menus. Having to navigate those menus, I see how far Blackmagic's come, especially being able to use a touchscreen these days with their menus. Regardless of how much it sounds like I hated this camera, I actually really did enjoy my time with it. Just not the price I paid. You see, after tax, I paid $626.77 for the body and a power adapter to plug it into the wall. After adding all the other accessories, it was another couple hundred. Had I been able to score the camera for a nice 350, I think that would have been the perfect sweet spot for me. And then I could have picked up a better lens, especially something with image stabilization, and I think it might have been a better experience all around. That being said, I think I am just really used to the creature comforts of modern cameras, and would probably be better off with some of the smaller offerings from Sony, Fuji, Panasonic, or honestly just sticking with my iPhone, as realistically, I'm totally fine with the video capabilities of any modern camera. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments, as well as if you have any favorite camera that you feel fills this niche for you. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.